So, hello and welcome to another episode of the Journal Links podcast. And welcome back if you've been here before. To get everyone up to speed, this podcast is for journalists, podcasters, and bloggers, or anyone similar to tell their own stories. My name is Conor O'Brien, and I'm a journalist. I run Courageous Nerd, an entertainment and pop culture platform which features interviews with actors, writers, and filmmakers. Joining me in this episode is Tom Abadie. Tom, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Happy to be here.
And it's great to have you on. I suppose of all the guests I've been on so far, we go back the furthest. You're the first guest who I didn't meet doing my journalism qualification course. We go back a little bit further. We'll get into that as this goes along. But I suppose before we really dive in, for anyone who isn't familiar with you and like what you've been doing, could you give yourself a bit of an intro, just a brief snapshot into what you're up to?
So after doing my journalism course in the Netherlands, I've moved back to Paris, moved back in with my parents, where I'm originally from, and I've been freelancing as a journalist, mainly in sports, well, for many years now, but I guess more as full-time since I finished my studies in March. So I'm just working hard in Paris.
Lovely. Yeah. And we met at university doing undergraduate degrees. I guess it's fine to say it was University of Essex,
Yeah.
Lovely university. Yeah, great time. Weirdly, I guess, or interestingly, neither of us did a journalism degree. So I suppose
At the
what,
time, yes.
yeah, or back then, yeah. But like, what made you, at the time, want to pursue journalism? Like, what took you in that direction? Do you think?
I wanted to be a journalist since I think it's been over 10 years now. It's 2012 when I really got into podcasting as listener, mainly. But I think even before then, there was always a sort of a writing passion on my end. Like, I used to do, well, I was in France, I also did English classes, and we always had to every week write a short story. And I really enjoy doing those. So I think there's always been that sort of motivation there. And, it kept on going, loving to tell stories and with a big sort of passion for newspapers around me and my
Mm.
family. So it was always within, the family to get into that. So while I have no journalism friends at the time, I think it was like, okay, I want to do this. But my parents didn't want me to sort of pigeonhole myself, and a lot of journalists will say this: it's better to do a sort of a open-ended course before doing a journalism one, because it's easier to do something else in case you don't enjoy it. So I did a degree in sociology and politics in Essex for 4 years, including placement, and then went on to do my master's in journalism in the Netherlands.
Mm. Brilliant. Yeah. And obviously, the main connecting factor that we met through Essex's student media, Rebel. You obviously spent a number of years with Rebel. I was only really there in my last year, but we were the head and deputy head, respectively, of editorial in that year. So I suppose, like, how have the experiences you had with Rebel informed what you've gone on to do later?
It was fantastic. I mean, I was really going back through my articles preparing this show, even before Rebel. So I started officially publishing articles back in 2012, but I was already doing like sort of magazines on my own, on my word, and so on before that. But I think Rebel was my first big opportunity to not only publish for a wide audience. When you launch your own blog, you're going to get your family and so on. But with Rebel, I joined it from 2017 when I joined university. First weekend we had like the freshers fair, and someone said, "Oh, you should come and visit the studios." And I remember very vividly. It's on a Friday on my birthday, 2017, 30th of October. I visited the studios, and I met the head of editorial at the time and the head of radio, which I was doing also, and very quickly integrated the team in the in the culture section, sorry, which was something a bit different. I was more into sports at the time, but I thought culture was something that could definitely work for me.
Mm.
So I did the editorial and then radio with many shows at the same time. So I had a big first introduction to Rebel. Was nominated for several awards at the end of the year, which was great. But I think my biggest year is probably the second one, where I was, upgraded to deputy head of radio and head of culture, where, there's obviously Rebel at the time were doing magazines, so we had lots going on there, less maybe on the blog than we did in our final year on the website. But creating from start to finish a magazine is quite tough. And I remember my head of editorial having a lot of work with a dissertation at the time, so I was very much involved in the process. And to finish off my final year after my placement, I came back during COVID, and so actually not many people had joined Rebel, and so they were looking for someone with experience in that end. So I was nominated head of editorial, and I think I didn't really get a role in radio, but I think that was probably better off, seeing as the studios were mostly closed throughout the year.
Yeah.
But I continued doing podcasting on my own and with Rebel. But I think I really enjoyed doing that final year as head of editorial, having you on board as well, and having just a great team to write quite regularly articles. I think it's the year where obviously we had no magazines, so there was far bigger of focus on publishing online, and I'm quite proud of the output. I think it's between 30 and 40 articles throughout the year, and there's some very, very good ones, and I was delighted to see some of the articles be nominated and win for best article, while not being necessarily from the team, from actual outside writers. So I think it was a great year. It was tough, and I was half the year was in France and still doing the editorial meetings on Zoom, but we managed, I think.
Definitely. And obviously you mentioned it was during COVID, so we have kind of a unique experience, and we only interacted in terms of Rebel over Zoom. We recruited the team through Zoom. We never got to have an in-person meetup. It was obviously during the height of COVID. This is all happening, and we're talking about this a bit before we start the recording, where we have actually met one time in person in real life. It was before I was in Rebel, but basically, and obviously you would know him better than I would, but Alex Kemp, who was in Rebel, he put together a radio play, and he put out a thing on Facebook saying anyone who wants to come and do like a part in this play, kind of get in touch. So I was one of the people who reached out to him. I came along, and I was introduced to a bunch of like Rebel kind of people, people who had quite big roles in Rebel at the time. You being one of them. I remember that briefly, like shaking your hand, meeting you then, and then it had been
that goes way back then. That must have been 2019, I guess.
I think so, or maybe even earlier. It could have been 2018. But
possibly.
But I remember the name definitely when it came around to me joining Rebel as the deputy head of editorial. I'm like, oh yeah, I have met him briefly before, but yeah.
Well, here we are.
Yeah.
4 years down the line.
Full circle. Yeah, lovely. So yeah, and obviously, you leave Essex and you leave Rebel and you go up to do, as you mentioned, like a master's, wasn't it, in journalism in the Netherlands. So I suppose that what prompted that decision, like why that particular university, or like just kind of like what was that your thinking in going in that direction?
Realistically, I think coming out of those 4 years in the UK, this was the first time I was living properly in the UK. I'd lived only not only, but I'd lived exclusively in France, more or less before that, but of the US and Cambodia for my placement. But I really wanted to embrace my English side and try out the UK. And far and beyond was not a bad experience, far from it. But I think coming out of a quite challenging year with COVID, then with Brexit as well. Not that I was affected. I didn't have, I've got the British citizenship, but there was a lot of going on. And it was quite a difficult time in the UK. And I think I needed something else. I wanted to come back.
Some space.
Yeah, exactly. And try and come back closer to my family and friends back in Paris. So I attempted to get into, I think, 7 or 8 different journalism schools in France, where lots of elite ones, and all through like competitions and so on. And I got into none of them.
Right.
So at the same time, I applied for the Netherlands, where they had different programs. They had media studies in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. And Maastricht as well. But I got into all of them, apart from Maastricht, and the journalism program actually I ended up getting was in Groningen in the
Yeah.
north of the country, and it's a very good one. It's one of the rare journalism programs in English that is not in the UK.
Mm.
And it was I did a first year over there, so lots of half of the program was practical, so with TV pieces, news pieces,
Yeah.
radio, and so on, even photojournalism, and then a half theoretical one where we're learning about the business and the ethics of journalism and how to survive as a freelance and so on. So there was a bit of practical in that as to teaching us how to grow as a journalist and become a better one.
Mm.
But also just learning how to understand perspective and what is important in the news, what's not so important. And I think it was a fantastic year because I managed to cover a lot of different topics that weren't necessarily sports, which had become sort of a pigeonhole for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I was managed to cover whether it's environmental crisis in Brazil, local elections in the Netherlands, but also microdosing and refugees with Ukraine. We were doing a sort of a 1 week news week with a piece a day, and on the Thursday edition we had the breakout of the war in Ukraine, and I had to cover it. So that was quite a challenge, and you're calling up journalists that are already in Ukraine, including CNN journalists.
Mm.
You could hear the bombs behind. So that was really sort of, obviously it's hard to listen to and it's difficult for them, but it's you grow with those experiences. So I learned lots. And then since September, I was doing my thesis on sort of the relationship between representation of journalists in sort of academic work versus cinema. So, I took 6 movies, including Spotlight and so on, which a lot of journalism fans will know about, and trying to compare how they were represented. So that was finished in March.
Right. Brilliant. Yeah. And I suppose studying in the Netherlands, like what is like Dutch journalism like? Is there like anything that, people would be surprised about the Dutch journalism industry, or is it kind of, just what's it like?
I don't know if it's necessarily very different. I mean, the thing is, I wasn't working directly with the Dutch media. Obviously, we had our
Right.
own website, sort of similar to what we had with Rebel.
Mm.
I started our own WordPress for the class, and we were publishing articles. But I will say this: studying it, the Dutch specific news. Firstly, they're very good with news. Sort of like they have their own version of, in France it's AFP, but I guess you've got Reuters and I don't know what the English version of it. Do you have a British version of Reuters, I guess?
I'm not.
AP, Associated Press, I
Oh yeah,
guess.
that would be. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
So they've got their own channel of that in the Netherlands as well. And they're, for such a small country, they're quite good worldwide. But I think the main thing where they're probably best at, and it's quite simple, it goes back to what France does as well, is very good on investigative journalism.
Mm.
So you'll find that quite a lot of the people that went to work with Bellingcat, for example,
Okay.
are from Dutch media originally. So I think that's something that we have to underline, and they're very good in terms of investigating stuff around money, let's say money laundering and financial, claims and so on, that they're very good at. So, it's quite serious, I have to say. That's a bit like the rest of the country. They're very serious, but they're very good with what they do, and there's a very strong newspaper culture in the Netherlands as well, which is sort of dying in other countries, but the Netherlands still stays very close to that.
Absolutely. And I know obviously in my case, leaving uni and leaving Rebel, there was a bit of a gap in between, but I ended up doing something called the NCTJ. It's like the UK's
Yes.
journalism qualification. So and I know for me, because obviously I had Courageous Nerd, I was doing all this, and Rebel was like journalism based stuff, but it was more kind of, it was a fun thing. It wasn't like it wasn't my full-time job. It was just something I like doing. So I suppose for you, and maybe I can about my experience as well, transitioning from doing something like that to actually studying journalism, officially, like how did you find that?
I think the practical side wasn't so hard for me to transition into because obviously writing articles, as much as I will say this, the program has a bit dated, and some of the things they're not very good with mobile journalism and social media and all that stuff. But I think definitely my news pieces, which I'd never written a news piece before, like publish that short elements, 150, 200 words. I've never written one like that, a press release,
Yeah.
So there's some of those things where I had a different opinion to the teachers, and I guess I learned a lot from them. A lot of the teachers were journalists themselves before or while doing their job as a teacher. So there was a conflict of maybe ideas and perceptions between maybe, I don't know if it was necessarily English versus Dutch, as much as it was classes were in English. But I definitely learned a lot in terms of how to structure and so on. But I know that I was ahead of a lot of the other students in terms of creating radio pieces and create podcasts and so on. I had all the sort of technical side of it, even with TV. I'd learned how to use Premiere Pro with Rebel. So I was ahead in that aspect. But then the theoretical side was quite challenging, I have to say. I'd always done sociology, criminology, and politics. So while there are some of those elements in journalism, learning how to what kind of people are important to the news and perceptions of cultures and so on, that's important. But maybe understanding why a journalist will have a certain perception of a country. You think to how the US covers the Middle East and how that's affected by wars in the past. So that was at first very challenging and then got progressively more interesting, as much as I did struggle in certain elements. I can't hide that, particularly the business side. I didn't understand how to really put myself out there. I can't say it's something I mastered yet. I'm still doing a lot of freelance free work, non-paid work, but you learn how to put yourself out there and be your own niche and understanding how the market works and so on. So that transition, I think the more theoretical side was harder to transition into, but I'm so glad I did it. I could have done like a lot of, actually, you'll know better than I do, but a lot of British students do their undergrad and then not even just in journalism and like any field, and won't necessarily do their masters and just get a traineeship. Whether it's intern the companies or not, they'll go straight into work. I think for me, with the French model, where it's very, you need the degrees to prove that you are legitimate to be a journalist. I think I had to do that, and I'm glad I did it for the whatever I've learned there. So no regret there.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I know, obviously, thinking in my case, I went up and did the NCTJ, and you think how to do certain things. Obviously, you had the experience built up, and I don't know whether it's the same for you on your masters, where you basically get told, actually, no, like, here's a better way to do it. You kind of, I'm someone who's, I'm speaking, for the teachers, like, I'm somebody who's like actually been a journalist. I've had to do it. Like, trust me, like, here's a better way of going about it. Like, you've got a good foundation, but I can help you build up even further on what you've got. Like, did you find a similar thing? So obviously, like myself, you'd built up experiences already, but now going into a situation where there's people who've actually worked as journalists, were they able to help you improve what you already had?
Completely. I think structure was always something I struggled with in terms of maybe length. I was always more of a lengthy writer, not necessarily a feature, which I also discovered that I'm not actually that good at writing features before I started doing the course. We had to retell this story of a guy being chased by a bear in Canada or something like that.
Right.
And we had to sort of tell his story in a sort of journalistic way from an exterior point of view and still be around 1.5K words.
Right.
And I think the structure and then the quotes, because you had to make a sort of fake interview with this guy telling his own story. And so you have to learn how to create an atmosphere around the interview, sort of say, we're in this cafe and it smells of this and it smells of that. And I think I overestimated my quality in that aspect. So that I definitely learned a lot. And as I said earlier, the whole structuring the news and making a lot shorter, going from a 500-word piece to a very interesting and short-cutting piece of 200 or 250. That's a hard challenge, being able to cut down on words and going straight to the more important stuff was definitely something I didn't necessarily know coming into the course. And thankfully, Rebel let me sort of put my words out there. But I also know some of my editors at Rebel were like, this is far too long and you're not getting to the right thing. But
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily, I think at the time with Rebel, it was sort of like, yes, the editor is going to say this, but I know that my quality is this and that my niche and my own style of writing is this. So sometimes you have to sort of defend yourself, defend your writing in front of the editor, but also listen to what they're saying. So you sort of have to balance your quality as and what the person technically above you is telling you. So
Yeah.
I think that's something I've faced in the Netherlands of like, I know this is my quality and I know I'll use this in my career, but also I know this is a course where I have to get grades. And a lot of times I was not passing the grades because my writing was too different to what they
Right.
wanted. Sometimes it's like you don't want to be the teacher's pet, but you've got to adapt your writing for them to like it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'd be really interested to hear about your course, just because on my NCTJ one, it was such a diverse range of people. You know, you had like someone who might have been out of uni for a few months, who's kind of like trying to start out. There's people like me who were kind of like a few years out, but kind of trying to get into this new career. We even had people who were apprentices at places like Sky and the Sun, who were also part of this group. So that about 28, 30 people, so many different backgrounds. Was it similar on your master's course, or was everyone, in a similar place in life?
No, completely different places. I think that was even more the case than I had in the UK, where we had quite a few people above the age of 30 in the
Okay.
class. I was one of the younger ones, being 23 when I started the course. And we had some, 21, 22, because you got to have the time to do a bachelor's.
Yeah.
But some have been, you've got the Scandinavians who are out of their course a lot later than we are. Then there were some who did philosophy degrees and were like, I don't actually enjoy this and want to
Yeah.
transition to something else. I think a lot of in general, there must have been maybe 3 or 4 people who did an actual journalism degree as a bachelor's.
Yeah.
And a lot of them came from The Hague, where some of our teachers were teaching as well. But a lot of them were just more closer to what I did. So sociology, politics. Some of them were doing creative writing, as we saw with Alex Kemp,
Yeah.
notably, and we had similar examples there as well. So I think you had the 2 main avenues of like, for the theoretical side, it was more news, understanding the world, politics, anthropology, and so on. And then you had the ones who were very close to journalism, so creative writing,
Yeah.
or journalism specifically. I can't really think of people who did something completely out of there, apart from my housemate who was an engineer and
Right.
decided he wanted to do tech journalism,
Yeah.
which makes sense. You got your own niche and your experience
It lines up. Yeah.
with the industry, but you want to learn how to express it and how to become a tech journalist. So we had a variety of things, and the fact that we had 21 and 32-year-olds in the same class was really interesting. Some were married, some had children, some didn't, and it was a weird mix, but it was a very healthy one.
Well, I think it's also, and I'm glad you had that as well, because it's like indicative of, I think, the industry itself. I mean, there's not, you go into a newsroom, I think for the most part, there might be people who, okay, the ages might be a bit similar, but in terms of like life experiences, like, oh,
Completely different.
yeah, like, oh, I did a degree, or I didn't do a degree, but I did the NCTJ, so I got here directly. Or people who are older, as you say, it's nice to have like a different and even in terms of journalism itself, like a different range of voices, different perspectives, rather
Yeah,
than
and you bounce off them completely.
yeah.
I mean, I think having that variety in a newsroom, and I think we always had that, as much as obviously we had similar age groups in Rebel, but I think you'll see it from our final year. There were people from all around the world, all around the UK. We had Indians, we had Czechs and French, and
Yeah.
lots of different people. And I think that's what brings joy to myself and to other journalists, of seeing different voices and different perspectives. And that's what makes a balanced argument in the end.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And you're actually the first person on this I've interviewed so far who's a freelancer. So obviously it's a whole different slant to add to a conversation, right? So I know, obviously, like in my case, for instance, I work for a newspaper. So like for me, there's like, stability. Like I know, when my next shift is going to be, kind of thing, so to speak. So like in terms of like your perspective as a freelancer, like do you have And like, I don't mean to sound like a parent or anything, but do you have like long-term goals for the future?
Well, I think the fact that I finished my degree so recently, I was freelancing officially. Like the first paid opportunity I got was probably 2020.
Okay.
But I was getting regular gigs for free.
Mm.
2020 was also when I joined a French sports website where I think in the less than a year, I must have written 80 articles or something along those lines.
Wow. Well done.
Um, so doing lots of reviews and previews of games and so on. Um, so that was entertaining, and it got me into the rhythm and the structure and so on, and being able to put out an article very quickly or meeting deadlines and so on. Then when I started getting the very cheap paid opportunities, it was like, okay, I know there's even more of an incentive to get to this deadline. As much as I don't necessarily need the money, but it was like, okay, I enjoy having £5 an article.
Yeah.
It's like it's a validation for my work. But I think today it's like sort of taking a break since my the end of my degree, and I'm sort of enjoying writing different things and not necessarily looking for the money. I was thankful
Mm.
enough that during my thesis I was working as a waiter and I still live off that money
Okay.
today, even though I stopped a few months ago. So that's okay. I don't necessarily need the money, and I'm enjoying still writing for people I've enjoyed working with, even for free.
Yeah.
But I know the long-term goal is to continue doing this and starting getting paid for it, obviously.
Yeah.
But I do think I'd have a preference to integrate an actual structure of having, I come in at 9 and I finish at 6, and I know when my money is coming from,
Yeah.
because I think with a lot of freelance, I think it's harder when you start off. I think you can become a freelance after working 10 years and having that experience
Yeah.
and saying, I have this portfolio, you can recruit me. Today, saying I have X amount of experience, but it's not that well published or that well read,
Yeah.
it's hard to go to the BBC and say, I want a
Yeah.
freelance opportunity.
Hire me. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I also know that a lot of the industry is changing and that a lot of them are becoming more freelance rather than in the same company. So I'm open to different opportunities. I know that from September onwards, September to the end of 2023, I'll be traveling. So there'll be more
Right.
uh, freelance opportunities from abroad,
Okay.
covering stuff from wherever I am in Eastern Europe, in this case. Um, but the realistic goal is to integrate an actual newsroom from January onwards, whether that's
Mm.
TV or written, I don't know yet. But you've got that structure, and you know this better than I do. That at a certain hour you have to be there, and you have a certain deadline. We have to find a certain story,
Yeah.
the quotes and so on. The current situation that I'm in is like, do I really want to work today? I don't necessarily have to. I don't necessarily find the motivation. I'm not saying I'm lazy, far from it.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
just always seeking that next bill and the next paid opportunity
Mm.
is exhausting.
Right.
And you got to have the amount of contacts, which is also when I go back to the 10 years experience. You've got enough people around you that know where you can find paid opportunities and who you can trust and who you can't trust.
Yeah.
In these cases, it's like, well, how much are you going to pay me? Oh, we'll see when you finish the article. It's like, well, no, I need to know how much you're going to pay me and how do I enjoy working with you or not.
Mm.
So that's very tiring. And I think people who have, you know, I don't have to pay my bills yet. I still live with my parents.
Mm.
But people who've got kids and the bills and so on, and they're freelance, it's a tough life. I
Yeah.
can imagine.
Oh yeah, for sure, and yeah, it's a really interesting perspective to hear because obviously, like I mean, a bit like what you were saying earlier with other things. Like I've written little bits for websites, but I haven't like tried to be a career freelancer. And I'm sure there could be someone who's come across this who might, either might just qualified as a journalist, might be thinking about it, and yeah, because obviously it's a whole different ball game. And
And you're very independent, I think, on that
yeah,
aspect. You've got to seek out your opportunities. You've got to seek, I mean, obviously, different models in France than the UK in terms of um, taxes and so on. But you've got to handle all of that yourself. You've got to handle insurance. You've got to
yeah,
handle medical bills and so on. That maybe your company, if you're full-time employed, would be helping you with. So that's extra bills that you got to take into account when you're a freelance.
mm, For sure, yeah. So I've actually only got one last question prepared. So this might be where it ends, or maybe not. It might end up going further. But basically, if you cast your mind back to, I guess, when we were last working together, 2021, Rebel, Uni, and that time frame, and if you could speak to that Tom of that time, what advice would you give him? Knowing what's ahead of him, like, what would you tell them?
Um, well, at the time, not only was I doing Rebel, I also published independently a magazine, I think, ahead of
Right.
the Football European Championships,
Mm.
um, which I think at the time I didn't realize how monumental that was because I did it during my dissertation as well.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
was, doing my dissertation from 2 p.m. till maybe 6 or 7. And then from after dinner till like 5 a.m., I'd be working on this magazine by myself. And I think you've got to enjoy the little victories. It's
Mm.
not just always seeking the next thing, and which is why I go back to the whole freelance thing. It's like when you're freelance, you got to always seek the next position. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you caught slacking and so on. I think when you're in the industry and you meet incredible people, and I've met some very good footballers. I've met lots of personalities.
Mm.
There's many times where I've been in a room with someone. I'm like, how the hell did I end up here?
Yeah.
I've spoken to artists, and whether it's in the Netherlands or elsewhere, and you got to celebrate those little victories along the way,
Mm.
and but also learn from your lessons. It's not always going to be positive. Sometimes you'll have harsh criticism from the editors.
Mm.
Sometimes you also have to stand up. I've stood up in the last 18 months to 2 years to editors and told them your comments, the fact that they were made public, were out of line. And as much as I appreciate your support and the fact that you're still publishing my articles, I think that we can develop a different relationship, the two of us. And I'm also sure that other people in the newsroom would appreciate a different approach. And
Mm.
because all of these newsrooms are online, whether it's Slack or WhatsApp and so on,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's always a sort of different interpretation of messages and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm like, I might not be the only one that thinks this way. So, as I said, celebrate the little victories along the way because you might not get back to those opportunities.
Mm.
Particularly, I mean, I don't do journalism just for the famous people. I've been in rooms with some people who've had traumatic lives and who've had very difficult experiences with, I've been on scenes with floods, and I've been on
Yeah.
scenes where people have lost their homes, or they've been affected by the death of a relative. It's You can't really celebrate those on the moment because it's a harsh
Mm.
truth and it's a
Yeah.
harsh reality. But you're like, wow, what was that? That's an incredible experience. And
Mm.
obviously it's very hard to listen to, but the amount of experience you get out of it, whether it's from a journalistic standpoint or as a human, as a person, like, wow, I've learned a lot from this elder person about their lives. And
Yeah.
you've got to learn from those lessons and learn from those little victories and how to bounce forward and keep on growing. And I think that's what makes you a better journalist is learning from mistakes, but also
Mm.
celebrating what you've done well previously. And that's going to help you become, at the age of 30, 35, maybe even 40, the best version of a journalist you can be. Maybe
Yeah.
it'll be older, some incredible journalists who still work at the age of 65, 70, and so
70.
on.
Yeah.
I do think maybe at some point you're less connected with certain points of society.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking to maybe, and this is not a criticism, but I imagine certain elder journalists trying to cover stuff about social media
Pop
or
culture. Yeah.
pop culture and so on. And they might be slightly disconnected, which is why I
Right.
go back to 30, 35, 40, when you still, maybe you've got kids who are at that age and you're
Yeah.
connected with that aspect of society. But any experience is going to be a good experience, even if it's a bad one on the moment and you manage to get out of it unscathed or just a bit, then you'll learn from it. And even if it's a harsh experience and you've suffered from it, then you've got to learn how to process it
Mm.
and learn from it. Keep yourself in check. Obviously, I know it's a difficult industry where the news is not necessarily always very positive.
Yeah.
We all know that, but you got to learn from it and say, okay, well, this was tough, but
Mm.
I can experience this again, or I might not, but I know how to handle it if I do.
Yeah. Well, Brilliant. That's really interesting to hear. And yeah, just thank you again for taking the time to chat
You're welcome.
today. And yeah, I wish you continued success with what you go on to do. And yeah, hope everything works out. All the best and take care.
Thank you.